Okay, so the first strategy that I'd like to talk about for coping with stress is reappraisal. And this is one that personally I use a lot myself. So let's see. So reappraisal is the reconstruing of a potentially emotional or stressful situation in a way that decreases its emotional valence. So this word really comes from a lot of the emotion regulation literature as well as the stress regulation literature. Again, like you saw this term in our transactional model of stress, right? This is something that we can do to intervene both to prevent a full-blown stress response to a potential stressor, as well as that response is happening to prevent it from becoming a full-blown stress response, right? So this is something that we can use at the beginning to prevent us from becoming stressed, as well as something we can use to prevent the stress from getting out of control. So again, it's reconstruing the situation or event in a way that makes it less stressful in some way. And we'll talk about some different ways that we can do this. There's some different types of reappraisal. So my little comic here is these two ketchup bottles. They're looking at this blob on the ground and they're saying, don't worry, it's not a ketchup stain, it's just blood, right? And so we do the opposite. I do this all the time when watching crime shows and things. I'm very easily grossed out by things like blood and guts on crime shows, although I do really like the story, and so I have to constantly be telling myself that's not real, that's just, jello, that's just, someone's whole job is to make that look really realistic, and wow, they did a good job, but that's not real, right? And so that's not so much with stress as with a disgust emotion, but the same kind of processes work for reconstruing and reappraising stress as well. So there's different types of reappraisal. So one type is what's called detached reappraisal, and I like to think of this as when you're trying to sort of turn the volume down on your experience of that emotion or of that stress. You're trying to not fully necessarily escape it, but you're trying to dampen that experience in some way. And so you can do this by self-distancing. We think of this as taking a step back from the situation. You might try to take a third-person perspective on it, see how you would think about it if you were someone else viewing it from the outside. And you might also literally take a step back and take some time to think about the situation, right? And so this is a detached form of reappraisal. You're trying to sort of remove that sense of self being fully invested in this, and that makes it feel less relevant and therefore less stressful. Other ways you can self-distance is to really say that this is not the most important event. People often engage in the exercise where you say, in a year, how much am I going to care about this, right? This is a way, again, of giving yourself some perspective and engaging in self-distancing to turn down the volume on that response. Another way we do this is through the acceptance of that negative state. This is a goal of many types of meditation and mindfulness, is to really say, it's okay that I'm really upset and stressed about that, and rather than trying to prevent that, just to sit with that and to accept it. And some evidence has shown that actually can help us to cope with it better, to just accept that rather than to push against it. And then, although we feel it strongly, it doesn't last for as long. And so this is another type of reappraisal. You can also engage in what's called positive reappraisal, and this is where you're attempting to evaluate that situation specifically in a more positive light. This is sort of the most commonly talked about form of reappraisal. You saw it in the definition on the last slide, but this is where you're really trying to, again, see that situation in a different way. So this is the finding the silver lining that people always talk about, right? So maybe everything is really bad in many ways, but you find something positive about it, some lesson that you've learned, some positive aspect of it, and you focus on that. And then there's also what's called arousal reappraisal, and this is one I'm going to talk more about because I think this is really interesting and one that I probably have not learned as much about in other classes. And this is where, rather than try to change how you perceive the situation or change your experience of the emotion by self-distancing, you engage in what's called arousal reappraisal, where you reinterpret the meaning of the arousal or stress state that you're experiencing. And so this is particularly useful for reappraising stress, whereas some of these other ones work well for stress as well as other emotions. Arousal reappraisal is really excellent for trying to reinterpret the meaning of what your body is doing when it's stressed out, in ways that help you to reduce that stress, but also to experience it as less aversive. And so I'll talk about how that works. And so, we might often be told things when we're stressed out. Someone might tell us to keep calm and carry on. We see these messages everywhere, or to calm down, or just to relax, just breathe. And while this can be really great for reducing stress in some types of situations, that's not always what we want to do, right? We talked in the previous lecture about allostasis, and for different activities there's different optimal levels we want to be at, right? And so when you're engaging in an assessment, or you're going to jump out of a plane for skydiving, you don't necessarily want to be calm, right? Your body doesn't want to be at its rest state. It wants to be at a state that's optimal for that challenging, exciting activity that you're engaging in. Your body needs to mobilize some resources to engage cognitively with that assessment in order to get your heart rate up for that jump, and engage in all of the physiological processes that make that possible. And so the goal shouldn't necessarily always be to keep calm and carry on. And so also, this can be a problematic message, because I'm sure you've experienced this when you're really stressed out and someone tells you to just calm down. You're like, I can't. If I could, I would. That's the point, right? You're very stressed out. Your heart is racing. Maybe your palms are sweating. And it's really hard to turn that into just stop that, to turn that into a calm state. But what we can see, though, is that actually other states that are more positive do look physiologically similar to stress, right? When you're feeling really excited and amped about something, your heart also races. You might also sweat then. You might experience a lot of the same kinds of physiological symptoms or experiences or activation as when you're feeling stressed. And so capitalizing on this similarity in these two physiological states is what arousal reappraisal is doing. And so what you do with arousal reappraisal is you say, yeah, my heart is racing, but this is actually an indicator that I'm excited and I'm really amped up, and I'm ready to engage with this challenging task that's in front of me. And so rather than feeling overwhelmed and stressed, I'm feeling excited and engaged. And so to test the efficacy of this type of strategy, I want to talk about one study here that did this in the context of the GRE, or the graduate record exams, right? So some of you may be thinking about taking these. These are really important, becoming less so over time, which is wonderful, but they're important for getting into graduate school in many programs. And so these are obviously a high-stress, high-stakes assessment, right? So certainly students are stressed when they're taking these. And so what they did in this study is that, this is a quote from it, right? They said, arousal reappraisal is the strategy of situational reframing of stress-related anxiety or arousal as a tool that facilitates your performance rather than an obstacle to overcome. And so what they did in this study is they brought two groups of students, and they had them do intervention in one group, and the other group didn't do anything. And in the intervention group, they essentially told them that it was true that thinking about your heart racing as being a sign of a tool that you're going to do well. This led people to actually, as we'll see, do better overall on the GREs. So first, actually, I want to look at what happens with their stress, right? So they're really stressed going into this exam. This is the real GRE, and so they are going to also look at their cortisol as a measure of stress. And so you can have people spit into a tube, and you can assess how much cortisol is floating in their body at that time, and that's indicative of the stress that we're under, right? That's one way of indexing how much your HPA axis is activated. We learned about that in our last lecture, right? That's an important part of that stress response, and so we can assess how active that is. And so we want to see if there's differences in that, and we also want to know, is this reappraisal of this stress not just making you less stressed, but does it lead you to do any better? And so what they find first, looking at cortisol, or this is not exactly cortisol, this is a particular enzyme that's in your spit, and they looked at this in this study. It's called SAA. This is not important for you to memorize exactly what that is, but it's one enzyme that we can look at that's indicative of stress. It's a little bit counterintuitive. I've noted here that higher levels of salivary alpha amylase indicate less stress. And so what we see first is that in the reappraisal condition, people, so they spit in the tube immediately after taking the GRE, and this is really indicative of your stress levels about 20 minutes prior, and those in the reappraisal condition are less stressed, as indicated by this SAA, than those in the control condition who just took the test as normal. So this is a way of assessing how active is their sympathetic nervous system, and so this is much less active in the reappraisal condition than in the control condition, so indicative of less stress, at least physiologically. Then we can look at how they did performance-wise, and so what they found was that in the reappraisal condition, they did significantly better on the math. There was no significant difference in the GRE verbal. They make some speculations in the paper about how that's less susceptible to differences based on stress and anxiety, that you sort of know the words or you don't, whereas with math, there's more room to make mistakes if you're stressed out, and so they significantly improved their performance on the math relative to the control condition. So I do this all the time now. Whenever I'm feeling stressed about a lecture or anything, I tell myself I'm not stressed. I'm really or I tell myself that this feeling that seems like stress is really just an indicator that I'm really engaged and ready to do well at this task. So the fact that my heart is racing means I really care about teaching and lecturing. It doesn't mean that I'm anxious and not prepared. It means that I'm really engaged and ready to go. Another study that looked at this is one of my favorites of all time. They looked at this in the context of singing karaoke, and here they did a even simpler manipulation of arousal reappraisal. So they had participants simply say to themselves, I'm really anxious about having to sing karaoke in the lab in this kind of weird setup, or I'm really excited about that, or they said nothing. And so they came into the lab and they were hooked up to this Nintendo Wii, right? And they had one of those games with the vocal analyzer that sees how well you sing, and this was their dependent variable. They wanted to see the impact on performance, right, of this reappraisal. So participants came in and they either said, I'm anxious about this, I'm excited about this, or they were asked, or they weren't asked to say anything, right? So this was the manipulation. They made them say these things to another participant, and then they sang. And what they found was that those who were in the I am excited condition, where they said that they had a singing accuracy score of about 80%, whereas those who stated that they were anxious only had a score of about 52%. So that's a really massive difference. I've been watching the karaoke shows on Netflix. Like, if you get an 80%, like, you're going to win the show. That's pretty awesome. And the no self-statement or control condition, so what they would have gotten if they didn't engage in either of these manipulations was about a 69% in terms of singing accuracy. So pretty cool. In this study, they didn't directly look at any physiological measures of stress, but they talk about following up on that in the future. But this is a really great example of how simple it can be. They simply asked them to tell the next person in the study that they felt anxious or they were excited, or just not to say anything about it, and they produced this really strong effect on something that seems like you're good at it or you're not. And they had a really strong effect there. They also showed this in another study with public speaking, so it's not just with karaoke. And so people who stated, in this case, they only had two conditions, I am calm versus I am excited. So they compared those two here. And so telling yourself before you were going to engage in a public speech in front of other people that you were feeling calm was related to poor performance on that speech. So the person was rated as being less persuasive, less competent. This is by outside coders who don't know what condition they're in. So they said that they were less competent and confident, less persistent, and they also didn't talk for as long as people who said that they were excited. And so again, this was a manipulation, right? They asked them to state this. It wasn't a measure of how much they were excited or calm starting out. They just asked them to say this to someone else, and simply stating that led to these significant differences in the performance on the speech. So I highly recommend that that strategy of reappraisal. And so future research is looking more into exactly how this works, but it seems pretty clear that this is something that works, and that it works through shifting the amount of sympathetic relative to parasympathetic activation, and truly leading to less of a stress response when people engage in this reappraisal, whether that's seeing the arousal as a tool to help their performance be stronger, or whether they're seeing that arousal as a sign of excitement. This can improve their performance and also reduce physiological measures of stress. So, stop there.